This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Adele Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. China's top political advisory body concludes its annual meeting, pledging to drive modernization through reforms. Meantime, Beijing's tariffs on certain U.S. agricultural products take effect today. And as America's largest overseas market, China's retaliatory move escalates the trade fight between the world's two largest economies. And North Korea launches a barrage of ballistic missiles as South Korea begins its Freedom Shield joint drills with the U.S. Pyongyang warns that the exercises are provocative acts that could spark conflict. South Korean prosecutors vowed to pursue an insurrection conviction for impeached President Yoon Suk-yeol, who walked free over the weekend after spending 52 days in detention over a short-lived martial law decree. Also in East Asia tonight, Japan marks the 80th anniversary of the U.S. firebombing of its capital during World War II. And despite being the single most destructive aerial bombing in history, it now runs the risk of fading away from memory. China's top advisory body has concluded its annual session, calling for greater efforts to serve the country's modernization drive. President Xi Jinping was among the leaders in attendance at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing. Chairperson Wang Huning urged the top advisory body to give full play to its political role by uniting all Chinese people.
要坚持人民政协为人民，加强人民政协 反映社情民意，联系群众，服务人民机制建设，不断巩固全国各族人民大团结，加强海内外中华儿女大团结。
China's top legislative body, NPC, will continue to deliberate today and wrap up tomorrow. All right, for the very latest, we are joined now by CNA's Tan Yuguan in Beijing. Yuguan, quite a few reforms and announcements being made, but walk us through some of the key takeaways from the CPPCC annual session this year.
Well, the CPPCC, we should remember, has no lawmaking power, so it's essentially like a brain trust for the Chinese government. So it's all about the suggestions from delegates. There were some interesting ones this year, some of which kind of reflects the people's concerns, while others are more big picture. Among them was one aimed at addressing the declining birth rate. There was a professor who proposed reducing the legal marriage age to 18 for both genders. That's down from 22 for men and 20 for women. The delegate argues that a lower marriage age would allow for more kids, although it's unclear how that would work for nearly 2/3 of the population in China live in cities, and they are increasingly marrying much later than the legal age and also having fewer to no kids due to the cost of living issues. There were also another suggestion that addressed parental concern about their kids' screen time. Famous former basketballer Yao Ming suggested setting a day for mobile screens to be switched off for 24 hours for kids and parents alike. He says that he wanted to allow kids to have a chance to enjoy the great outdoors, to engage in sports, to enjoy real-life interactions without devices. In all, there were over 5,890 suggestions mooted this year, of which 5,002 of them were accepted for further consideration. Now, a substantial fraction of those suggestions will be taken quite seriously. At the sideline of this year's session, a spokesperson revealed that last year, more than 5,000 suggestions were also adopted by various government departments, leading to over 2,000 policy measures. Now, one standout area is the area of elder care. A Vice Minister of Civil Affairs noted that 87 suggestions and proposals from the two sessions shaped nationwide efforts to improve elder care services. These include developing near-home elder care to allow seniors to live comfortably in familiar surroundings. Oteli?
So you've got quite a number of issues and policies raised here, but all in, how would you say, how do you think the delegates responded to them?
Well, there are over 2,000 delegates, so it's pretty hard to be sure what all of them think. But for most of the delegates that we speak to, or we manage to speak to, the economy is definitely at the top of their minds, while many are outwardly optimistic that this year's goal of 5% growth, that's the same as last year's. They are also quite realistic of the challenges ahead. Let's take a listen.
我们今年的预期指标又定在5%，这个当前的话，我们还是遇到不少的困难，比如说外部的冲击，内需也不是很足，所以的话呢，在这种情况下面，去年实现5%是来之不易的。那么今年再确定5%，基数那么大了，还要保持这个速度的话呢，这个要跳一跳，就像打篮球一样，这个抢篮板球一样才能实现。不过呢，我们有很多的优势，包括体制的优势、超大规模市场的优势，这个人才储备的优势。我们14亿人啊，有2.4亿人是受过高等教育的。
我们的创新还是要去解决这个算力的芯片的问题，这个还是目前还是对我们有影响。因为下一步大模型，DeepSeek 是个暂时的胜利，那么下一步大模型还是要去做那个 AGI， 就是通用人工智能啊，或者 CS 甚至 ASI 超级人工智能，这个还是一个很难的事情。我们国家不能躺在这个 DeepSeek 这个成功上，我们还是要继续奋斗，投入更多的力量去紧追国际上的先进水平。
While we're on the topic of the delegates' sentiments, earlier this morning during the closing of the CPPCC, there were 4 resolutions being passed. All 4 were passed pretty much unanimous agreement, while 2 were passed with a unanimous yes from all 2,080 delegates. One resolution on the report, the Standing Committee of the CPPCC had 1 opposing vote, while another report on how the proposals were handled since the last CPPCC meeting had 1 dissenting vote and 1 abstention. Such isolated incidents of opposing votes are not unusual, but it does give you a sense of how things usually go at the closing of the CPPCC.
All right, many thanks for that report. Appreciate it. CNA's Tan Yu-guan in Beijing. China over the weekend has pledged new initiatives and more funds to stabilize employment, calling it a top priority. On the sidelines of the annual 2 sessions in Beijing, officials also say that they will ramp up efforts to support the struggling housing market. CNA's Tan Si-hui with a report.
The news conference addressing the livelihoods of the people has become another closely watched event on the sidelines of the annual 2 sessions, particularly as unemployment, especially among young people, becomes more prominent amid a prolonged housing crisis. Officials acknowledge that stabilizing employment is set to be an arduous task, with 12.22 million fresh graduates set to enter China's job market this year, marking another record.
就业总量压力不减，结构性矛盾更加突出，群众就业增收面临压力，同时外部环境更趋复杂严峻。 国内经济回升向好的基础还不稳固，可能都会对就业产生一定的影响。
However, Ms. Wang noted that the central government's 2025 targets of GDP growth of around 5% and over 12 million new urban jobs demonstrate its determination to implement strong measures to ensure employment. The resolve comes on the back of officials' positive assessment of measures announced last September to support the struggling property market.
全力推动房地产市场止跌回稳，一套组合拳呢。 在各方面的共同努力下，现在市场的信心得到了有效的提振，房地产市场也出现了积极的变化。
Mr. Ni pointed to the improved home sales numbers in the last quarter of 2024 and the first 2 months of this year. He said government agencies will next focus on intensifying the implementation of measures introduced last year, including interest rate cuts and increased loans for home purchases. The 90-minute news conference featuring senior officials from 4 government departments also highlighted some of the Chinese government's policy priorities, including the impact of AI on unemployment and measures that will be taken to address the situation.
China, meantime, is also grappling with external challenges that will have an impact at home. Beijing's 10 to 15% tariffs on U.S. agricultural imports have come into force today in retaliation to President Donald Trump's levies on Chinese imports. The new duties will cover chicken, wheat, corn, and cotton. On Wednesday, Washington's 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum imports are scheduled to take effect. Now, for more insights, we are joined now by Dr. John Quelch right here in the studio. Now, Dr. Quelch is Executive Vice Chancellor of Duke Kunshan University. Also good to have you here with us today, Dr. Quelch. So let's just talk about some of these of China slapping tariffs on U.S. farm products that basically taking effect today. Curious to know, does Beijing have any real leverage here? I mean, in this trade war, like a strong counter strategy, or are they simply, it's a tit-for-tat thing reacting to the U.S. moves?
So Beijing has so far been proportionate and deliberate in its measured responses to the Trump tariffs, as was the case in the first Trump administration. The leverage that they are attempting to use is by selectively targeting constituencies, the farmers, and then in the previous set of responses, the energy sector. These are constituencies that supported President Trump in his election. It's also worth noting that China investment in the United States is only 1/5 of U.S. companies' investments in China. So although the trade situation is in favor of China vis-a-vis the U.S., the investment is much higher by the U.S. in China than China's investment is in the U.S. So there's some leverage there. The final point I'd mention is that in the White House, there's obviously a group of very technology-oriented folks, such as Elon Musk representing Tesla. We also have the tech entrepreneurs and major tech companies like Apple and Meta, Microsoft, and so on, who are very invested in China and really don't want to have their supply chains seriously disrupted by an ever-escalating tariff war. So I'm very optimistic at the moment that we will not see the tariffs go to 60%, which was one number that President Trump had threatened at some points in the campaign.
So you think right now it's just going to be capped at this level for now?
Well, I'm hopeful. I can't be sure with the current administration in Washington. You can never be sure. But I'm hopeful at this juncture that the focus will be on settling Canada, settling Mexico, and not turning, and then perhaps turning to a deal or a rapprochement of some sort with China. It is actually encouraging, in my view, that the Trump administration went after all 3 of the biggest trading partners of the United States, Canada, Mexico, and China, rather than singling China out alone.
Yeah, so we do notice that. Nevertheless, we see Trump raising tariffs and then China retaliating, this back and forth. At what point, Dr. Quelch, do you think this cycle will actually start hurting both economies? And I guess the bigger question is there a breaking point where one side has to actually back down?
So I think what President Trump is thinking is the following. He's thinking, number one, international trade as a percentage of gross domestic product in the United States is 25%. But in China, it's 35%. So China economy relatively more dependent on international trade than the U.S. economy. And then you add to that the extreme imbalance in terms of the trade deficit that the U.S. is running with China. President Trump thinks he can out-tariff China. He can cause more pain to China than China can cause to the United States. At the moment, the estimates are that all of these tariff activities of President Trump are going to add $2,000 per year to the average bill of a U.S. household. That's around about 3% of gross income of a U.S. household. So perhaps not enough
Americans
to
will be happy with
really,
that, yeah.
to really inflict massive pain on the U.S. consumer at the moment. Definitely will add to inflation, but maybe not enough yet to cause a destabilization of the U.S. economy. The China economy, on the other hand, is weak at the moment in terms of domestic consumption. If all of these exports were unable to be sent to the United States, the Chinese economy at the moment could probably not absorb all of that production in its domestic economy.
So, Dr. Quelch, I want to move on to what some of the suggestions and reforms that have been announced over the weekend during the two sessions. And jobs was a big thing. And as a matter of some statistics here, that youth and unemployment in China is very high. It's at 15.7%. And AI, as you know, it's going to be disrupting all the job markets worldwide. How do you think China should be, balancing driving automation for efficiency and at the same time ensuring that there is sustainable employment for millions of workers?
So China has to double down on technology innovation to make sure that its world-leading capabilities are further developed in these very important STEM areas, including AI. The unemployment rate for youth has actually improved since it peaked at around about 21% youth unemployment. So it's come down a little bit. The fact of the matter is, Ortelli, that not every child is going to be a STEM genius. Yeah. And we have to understand that it's a reality. And so the service sector of the Chinese economy has to develop further. One example of that would be the tourism and hospitality industries that can absorb a lot of labor that is not necessarily STEM capable, even with the best vocational training. So I think that there are policies that can be put in place to lift up domestic consumption and foreign tourism, for example, that could help in a little bit of a way to mollify this very severe youth unemployment problem.
So from youth unemployment, we also have this aging population issue where it is projected to reach 30% by 2035. I mean, that's quite staggering. So how do you think that China is addressing the economic challenges, right? I mean, of having to handle this aging society and then at the same time ensuring that there's social infrastructure, that there is healthcare, overall economy that's equipped to be able to support this demographic shift?
So part of the economic development story of China involves urbanization, and around about 2/3 of the Chinese population now lives in urban areas. Many of those people are now living remotely from their parents. Right. And so as the parents age, the ability of their children, in many cases just one offspring, to help out around the home is reduced because of the job mobility that has accompanied urbanization. So it becomes important for the government and local communities to provide health clinics, to provide preventive health care, to provide telehealth and other approaches that will sustain those elderly people when in many cases they're not able to be supported directly by other family members. I might also mention, at the other end of the spectrum, the level of attention that Chinese parents pay to their children's education is commendable, but often that is at the expense of the children being allowed to engage in significant daily or regular physical activity. They're studying math all the time. And actually, if they don't develop the habit of physical activity as youngsters, they're not going to carry that into adulthood. And that's going to result in a lot of health-related problems together with poor eating habits of high-fat, high-sugar content foods. All of that is going to result in bigger healthcare challenges for the population in the long term, as well as the aging issue, which you've correctly identified.
Yeah, and I think that's why the government highlighted once again about this 3-year weight management campaign that they've rolled out. I guess it's just to ensure that they can sustain healthcare in China and make sure the people stay healthy.
Well, a staggering 50% of Chinese population is considered to be overweight or obese at the moment, and that may increase to over 60% by the end of the decade. That's a very severe problem because we know that obesity and being overweight can result in many chronic diseases, including diabetes, which can be extremely costly to society. So keeping China healthy and making sure people are aware of what they need to do from a nutritional and exercise point of view is very important to maintaining economic development at the pace it's been going.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to be covering that 3-year weight management campaign a little later on our program, but it's been so good having you in our studio. Thank you so much, Dr. Quelch, for joining us. And I was just talking to Dr. John Quelch, Executive Vice Chancellor of Duke Kunshan University. We're going to go for a short break now, but coming up next on East Asia Tonight, Russia moves to save its auto industry from the onslaught of swelling imports of cheap Chinese cars. And the Japanese government moving to address the shortage of a vital staple in the nation as rice prices surge. Hello again. Good to have your company on East Asia Tonight. Roland Lim is here with me with a roundup of business news as usual. And Roland, today we're talking about Japan's base pay. Apparently it's seeing its biggest jump in more than 3 decades.
That's right, Otelli. But the 2-year high inflation putting a drag on real wage growth. Now, Japan's real wages fell in January after 2 months of slight gains. That's despite base pay rising at its fastest pace in 32 years. Regular pay rose by 3.1% from a year ago, the biggest jump since 1992. Overtime pay was also up by 3.1%. But inflation at a 2-year high is undoing all these advantages. Inflation-adjusted real wages, which determines consumers' purchasing power, fell 1.8% in January from a year earlier. Fresh food prices, a major factor, rising at the fastest pace in 2 decades, with the overall inflation rate hitting 4%. The figures come as unions and employers hold their annual wage negotiations this week. Japan's biggest labor group has said its member unions are demanding an average 6.09% pay hike. That's their boldest demand in more than 30 years. The Bank of Japan likely keeping tabs ahead of its policy review next week. It is widely expected to keep interest rates unchanged, as officials cite the need to gauge the sustainability of wage growth after its rate hike back in January. Meantime, the Japanese government is releasing some of its emergency rice stockpile in a rare auction, and that's to help drive down the surging price of the staple. Now, prices have nearly doubled over a year, with the shortage driven by poor harvests as well as panic buying over a mega earthquake warning last summer. The Agriculture Ministry is expected to select successful bidders for 150,000 tons of rice by Wednesday, and the auctioned grain is expected to reach shops by the end of this month. The country keeps 1 million tons for emergencies, but this is the first time that supply chain issues are driving the response to the crisis. Taiwan's TSMC recorded a 39% revenue jump in the first 2 months, quickening from the same period last year. That suggests demand for AI chips appear to be growing unabated. The world's largest chipmaker reported combined revenue for the first 2 months of around $17 billion, and that compares with 34% growth for the whole of last year. Analysts on average are projecting growth about 41% this quarter. TSMC sales are being watched to gauge the strength in the AI sector. Now, its growth is seen as a sign of healthy spending on artificial intelligence computing. Last week, Taiwanese Hon Hai Precision Industry, also known as Foxconn, posted a 25% rise in revenue during the first 2 months of this year. Meanwhile, TSMC faces uncertainty in 2025, including the potential for U.S. tariffs on chip imports, which could impact its business. Russia is trying to curb a flood of Chinese vehicle imports, a move that could hit Chinese manufacturers hard. According to the China Passenger Car Association, exports to Russia last year hit sevenfold the level of 2022, as sanctions over its invasion of Ukraine cut off Western brands. Now, car makers in China also embrace the Russian market after anti-dumping measures hit sales in other regions, including the US, the EU, and Brazil. Now, Russia bought more than 1 million Chinese vehicles last year, handing Chinese brands 63% of the Russian auto market and leaving just 29% to local car makers. Russian authorities are pushing back, though. In January, Moscow raised the so-called recycling fees, which act like tariffs, to $7,500 for most passenger cars, and that's more than double from last September. These charges are set to rise by 10 to 20% annually until 2030. A recent Russian inquiry also found 3 Chinese truck makers violated safety standards and banned the sale of one model. Now, more compliance checks could follow. And you're all caught up with the business news. So, Telly, back to you.
Thanks so very much for that, Roland. Well, good time now for another break, but coming up on East Asia tonight, South Korean prosecutors vow to pursue jail for Yoon Suk-yeol after the impeached president walked free over the weekend. And tight security for former Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte in Hong Kong as he campaigns for his Senate picks. This is East Asia tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. North Korea fires multiple ballistic missiles after condemning military drills between the U.S. and South Korea as a dangerous provocative act. Beijing begins levying 10 to 15% tariffs on U.S. agricultural imports, hitting back against Washington's 25% duties on steel and aluminum imports that's due on Wednesday. China's top political advisory body concludes its annual meeting, pledging to drive modernization through deepened reforms, high-quality development, and stronger national unity. The two sessions hasn't just focused on tech and trade rivalry with the U.S. or domestic economic issues. Just this weekend, the discussion about a 3-year weight management campaign and the press had the press and netizens buzzing.
因为毕竟有些同志啊，体重管理的不太好，这个腰围也太大了，体重也超重了，有的甚至也患上了慢性病，所以也需要专业医生和专业医疗机构的帮助。
You heard their laughter filling the press conference as the health official doubled down on healthier lifestyles, noting improved living conditions, but rising calorie intake and lack of exercise. His remarks quickly caught attention online. At one point, the hashtag 3-year action plan for implementing weight management hit top 4 on Chinese social media Weibo, while hospitals establishing weight management clinics trended even higher at number 2. Some shared their waist slimming workout routines, while others joked if failing to lose weight would mean monetary deductions. Even firemen from a local fire station in Shandong chimed in, encouraging a mix of exercise and proper diet, along with a video of them in action.
我觉得挺好的，然后反正现在很多人也有这个身材方面的焦虑嘛。
两会提出这个事情，可能为了全民健康更多去考虑吧。这个有帮助，确实是大家需要，因为这个压力这么大，工作又很繁忙，所以身体健康还是最关键的。
很胖或很瘦都不是特别的好，自己感觉不错。 就是感觉很健康的一个状态，比较有活力一个状态就还不错。
我也看到这个有政府在反内卷的这个倡议，那这样的话，其实我们有更多的时间进行去身材的一些管理，因为到了大概可能我大概30来岁，那可能我觉得以后健康是第一位的。
China's rising life expectancy has also resonated, rising to the second position on Weibo's trending chart. It's now at 79 years, up from 78.6 a year before. signifying a rapidly aging population. As more live longer and fewer have children, this poses challenges for the economy and healthcare system. Some netizens pledged to embrace the weight management campaign, hoping to push that number past 80. Now, moves to raise the standard floor height of residential units over 3 meters were also welcomed. Many praised its benefits, with some already looking forward to roomier living spaces. And for more of our coverage on China's 2 sessions, do head to our website, cna.asia. You can also follow news and all the latest updates via our mobile app. In other news, North Korea fired multiple unidentified ballistic missiles today, according to Seoul. South Korea's military says the missiles were fired towards the sea off the west coast at around 1:50 p.m. local time. The launch was conducted as South Korea and the U.S. kicked off annual joint military drills, the first such major exercise under the second Trump administration. CNA's senior correspondent Lim Yeon-suk has more on the drills.
Every year, soldiers from the U.S. and South Korea hold joint drills as part of preparations for any possible attack from North Korea. About 19,000 South Korean troops are taking part in this year's Freedom Shield. But unlike previous years, there will be no live fire drills this time. This was agreed by both sides following an accident in Pocheon last Thursday, where South Korean fighter jets dropped bombs on a civilian village by mistake during a live-fire drill with U.S. forces. The blasts destroyed residential buildings, part of a church, and a truck in Pocheon City, about 40 kilometers northeast of the capital Seoul. The top Air Force commander apologized for the incident on Monday.
국민의 생명과 재산을 지켜야 할 공군이 국민의 안전에 위해를 가했습니다. 절대 일어나서는 안 될 사고였고 다시 일어나서도 안 될 사고입니다.
Pilot error is suspected to be the cause of the accident, as a pilot entered the wrong target coordinates prior to takeoff. North Korea on Monday blasted the drill, saying Seoul and Washington would pay a price for their dangerous and provocative acts. This comes amid rising concerns over North Korea's military buildup. On Saturday, North Korea unveiled for the first time a nuclear-powered submarine under construction. North Korea state media released photos showing what it called a nuclear-powered strategic guided missile submarine and its leader Kim Jong-un visiting the shipyard. Experts have voiced concerns, saying that the naval vessel could carry nuclear-capable weapons, which would threaten not just South Korea, but also the U.S. Lim Yeon-suk, CNA, Seoul.
South Korean prosecutors say they will continue pursuing impeached President Yoon Suk-yeol's conviction for insurrection. That's despite a court ruling that ordered his release from prison over the weekend. Mr. Yoon has been on criminal trial since last month over insurrection charges for briefly imposing the martial law in December. The embattled leader walked out of a detention center on Saturday after prosecutors waived their right to appeal. Mr. Yoon's arrest was overturned last Friday on technical grounds. The head prosecutor, Shim Woo-jung, said he respected the court's ruling and that the decision not to appeal was based on, quote, due process of the law. President Yoon's release comes ahead of his insurrection ruling. The Constitutional Court is expected to decide in the coming days whether to oust or reinstate the leader. Former Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte says he is ready for possible arrest following reports of a pending warrant from the International Criminal Court. The warrant stems from Mr. Duterte's illegal drugs campaign, which started in 2016 and resulted in thousands of extrajudicial killings, according to human rights groups. The Philippine Presidential Office says it has not received any official communication from Interpol, but indicates that Mr. Duterte could be handed over if an arrest warrant is issued. Mr. Duterte, who is currently in Hong Kong, said he was not at fault for the drug war and justified it as a campaign for peace and national security. He made those remarks while addressing a campaign rally attended by thousands of Filipino workers yesterday, with his daughter, Vice President Sara Duterte, by his side. He was in the city to drum up support for his senatorial candidates ahead of the upcoming midterm elections. Mr. Duterte is presently staying at a hotel in Hong Kong under tight security. It's unclear how long he will stay in Hong Kong, which is not a party to the ICC. The court is investigating the former Philippine president for alleged crimes against humanity related to the deaths during his drug war. Local records estimate more than 6,000 people have died. Human rights groups suggest the toll may be much higher. Evacuation orders in northeastern Japan have now been fully lifted, 12 days after wildfires broke out in the country. The move follows yesterday's announcement that the fires in Ofunato City and Iwate Prefecture had been contained. Well, the final orders were lifted at 10 a.m. local time for the entire Sanrikucho Ryori district and 3 areas in Akisai-kicho. Now, these affected more than 2,400 residents from nearly 980 households. Authorities had kept these partial orders in place due to water supply disruptions, but officials say water services are ready to be restored. The city is keeping shelters open for now, while plans are underway to set up temporary housing for those whose homes were damaged. The wildfires burned through about 9% of Ofunato City, leaving 1 resident dead. The blaze also damaging 210 buildings, including 102 houses. 76 houses were completely destroyed. Firefighters remain on patrol to put out any lingering fires. Coming up next on East Asia tonight, why Chinese foreign arms imports have dropped more than 60% over the past 5 years. Japan today marks the 80th anniversary of the U.S. air raid of Tokyo during World War II, the single most destructive aerial bombing in history. The strikes, codenamed Operation Meeting House, saw waves of U.S. military aircraft firebomb the Japanese capital at night in 1945. The attack and resultant blazes killed an estimated 100,000 people and injured tens of thousands more. It was the Second World War's deadliest bombardment, using conventional weapons and comparable in scale to the atomic bomb devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki a few months later. But unlike the nuclear attacks, the bombing of Tokyo have remained largely ignored or forgotten in modern times. Elderly survivors such as a 94-year-old Shizuyo Takeuchi are making a last-ditch effort to keep those memories alive. She has spoken to younger generations of her family's experience and the trauma she experiences until now. Efforts are also being made to preserve memories at the center of the Tokyo raids and war damage, a museum dedicated to collecting records and artifacts of the attack.
歴史は遠のいていくんだけれども、体験した人の視点だけではなくて、やっぱり私たちはそれを絶対相対的に見えるはずって信じて体験した人がいなくなるから遠のいていくではなくて、もっといろんな複合的な見方でその体験を捉えていかないといけないんだなっていう。
Chinese arms imports have dramatically dropped by nearly 2/3 over the past 5 years. That's according to a report by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI. The change was attributed to China's growing domestic weapons industry, with locally designed and produced systems replacing equipment that was previously bought mainly from Russia. The SIPRI report added that China now has the capabilities to make its own engines for combat and transport aircraft, as well as ships and helicopters, and that Beijing is phasing out Russian arms imports and military equipment of European design.
The Chinese have become more sophisticated, but they've also been able to get technology transfer from Russia because Russia has been getting more desperate because the Ukraine war has been causing them economic troubles. So China has been benefiting in several ways from the Ukraine war.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is leading a delegation to Saudi Arabia, where he will first meet with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman ahead of talks with the U.S. to discuss a framework for ending the war. Russian forces, meantime, claim to have captured territory in Ukraine's Sumy region and retook multiple settlements in its Kursk region. Moscow's advance amid the withdrawal of U.S. intelligence sharing and military assistance for Kyiv threatens Ukraine's sole territorial bargaining chip. Ross Cullen has more from the Ukrainian capital.
Well, there will be a lot of diplomacy in Saudi Arabia over the next couple of days. The Ukrainian president will be there on Monday for one-on-one talks with the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And travelling with Volodymyr Zelensky will be a Ukrainian delegation that on Tuesday in Saudi Arabia will be holding crucial talks with an American delegation. It's a chance for Ukraine to try to reshape the narrative because these meetings on Tuesday will be held at ministerial level. Neither President Trump nor President Zelensky will be attending, and we know how much tension there is between the two leaders. For the Ukrainian side, it will be headed up by Andriy Sybiha, the foreign minister, and the American delegation will be led by Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State. We've been speaking to people here in Kyiv about those upcoming talks, the continued impact of the war on them personally, and also whether they believe that Ukraine can win.
Я думаю, наскільки це може бути влучно і наскільки це може бути з вигодою для нас. Я думаю, що це 100% буде на користь України. Якщо домовленості не буде в цей раз, в наступний раз буде це обов'язково. Наш президент докладає всі зусилля, щоб домовитися, щоб перемога була тільки за нами. Україна сильна нація, ми сильний народ і перемога однозначно буде за нами.
Війна забрала відчуття безпеки і захищеності в людей, ніби забрала той фундамент, на якому ми стоїмо. Також я як психолог, який працює з переселенцями, з внутрішньо переміщеними особами, помічаю, що людям важко адаптуватися на новому місці. У багатьох із них є ось ця вивчена безпорадність, коли вони перестають відчувати, що впливають на своє життя.
Налаштований оптимістично, з вірою, тому що вже більше 3 років іде війна. Війна дуже кровопролитна, а ми люди мирні, ми вміємо працювати, але не хочемо воювати. Вміємо воювати, але не хочемо. Тому ми хочемо миру.
For Ukraine, these talks on Tuesday will be an opportunity to put forward ideas on a possible truce, a possible ceasefire, also what conditions Ukraine would like to see fulfilled in order to be able to create acceptable circumstances for future negotiations with Russia to take place. And for the US, they will want to hear any possible concessions that Kyiv will be willing to make, and also if Ukraine will be willing to sign this proposed minerals deal between the two countries. Ross Cullen, CNA, Kyiv.
Well, earlier we spoke with Dr. Peter Layton, a visiting fellow of Griffith Asia Institute at Griffith University, and he shares his views on Europe's military readiness, the shifting arms trade, and the impact of global tensions on defense strategies.
The Ukrainian war has attrited Russian forces, particularly their mechanized forces and their army. Their air force is sort of 10% lower now because they've lost 10% of their aircraft. The problem that the Europeans have, though, is that if you want to ramp up your defence forces quickly, that is extremely difficult. There's normally a lead time of 3 to 5 years, and the Americans can be quite slow about delivering weapons you have ordered. The Americans only have one production line for most of their kit, and they have large orders. So ramping up quickly is a big ask. The Europeans are now shopping around the world, and South Korea and various countries like that are the benefits of this.
All right, I'd love to talk about the trickle-down effects in a moment, but first, I just want to ask you about another report that came out a few weeks ago, the Military Balance Report. It says that Russia's military expenditure is rising, outperforming all European countries combined. At this rate, how soon can Europe realistically arm itself sufficiently if they are to be concerned with the Russian threat?
So the Russians are rearming, but lots of it tends to be relatively simple equipment for the ground offensive, like, if you like, the artillery shells. And the cost of raising the size of their army is significant. The Europeans certainly have the potential of fielding a much larger military. And of course, the Russians at the moment are trying to rebuild their military as well, having suffered losses over the last 3 years.
Can you talk to us about the opportunities then, back to your first point, for other arms makers like India, China, or even Russia in this juncture?
I don't think there's much chance of the Russians, and it's not just because they're fighting. The Russians are having a lot of trouble building sophisticated arms. The Indians, for instance, have been, over the last 4 or 5 years, have been ordering many arms from Russia, but most of the arms that they've ordered have not turned up. They're either being used in the war or to rebuild Russian forces. So Russia as a supplier is rather doubtful at the moment. It's probably an unreliable one looking forward. I think there's sort of options for, say, South Korea, Japan maybe. There's a range of countries. I mean, the Europeans, as you said, France is the second largest exporter. So other countries around the world may benefit. Australia, for instance, there's a few arms manufacturers here who are exporting artillery shells, etc., into Germany.
All right. Well, the war in Ukraine, Dr. Layton, has played a major role in improving U.S. dominance in the arms trade. So how will a potential ceasefire that's currently being worked on in Kyiv affect defense firms in the United States?
This is an interesting question because a couple of tensions here. So at the present time, the Europeans are principally buying, as you said, sort of American arms because in the age of globalisation that we've just left, the Americans were pretty much a sole source supplier, and the competitive advantage that the Americans held was very high. The Europeans were unconcerned about any American dominance to a point because they had strong confidence they could rely upon the Americans. That confidence about relying on the Americans is now vanishing daily. And the Americans cutting off the intelligence data has really dealt it a big blow. So the Europeans, for their more sophisticated equipment, such as the F-35 fighter, are getting concerned about, well, the Americans have the ability with their software and their various means that they could actually stop European fighter fleets from operating. There's a kill switch there, so the Europeans think at least. With that idea in their mind, if there is peace in the Ukraine and it gives them a breathing space, the Europeans will probably be more inclined to build up their own arms industry and move away from the Americans as fast as they can.
And about the NATO countries involved in this whole discussion of the war, are they likely to give in to President Trump's call of buying even more arms from Washington? What's your take on this, especially in the face of, tariffs and discussions like that?
It does seem unlikely. And I suppose you can see that in the share market, in that European defence stocks have risen sharply and American defence stocks are falling. So I think the idea, it's the old story of the Trump administration. There's a lot of tensions and conflicts there that the left hand doesn't necessarily support the right hand. So I don't think that the Europeans will be looking to the Americans to buy arms first, unless the Americans can reassure them, and that would require a fair bit of doing, but could be done, and unless they can expedite the deliveries to them. For instance, the Estonians want to buy some of these HIMARS rocket systems, and they've been having a lot of trouble getting good delivery dates from the Americans, now talking about buying them from the South Koreans. I think that they're doing a bit of a bargaining approach there, but nonetheless it does show there are some options out there, and countries like Poland have certainly moved to buy South Korean gear as well. So I think that the American arms networks into arms sales into Europe have reached a high point, and they'll probably decline from here.
And that wraps up East Asia Tonight this Monday. Don't forget your headlines anytime at CNA.Asia. And look us up on Facebook and on YouTube. Thanks for watching.